Thank you, Tristan. Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Okay. It looks like we have quite a few folks here already. Hold on, I'm going to pull up my slides. Can everybody see the slide deck, the cover slide? Okay, great. Hi, Tracy. Hi, Cheryl. Everybody's muted. I think we should get started. Yeah, we're a few minutes in. So welcome, everybody, to the task force for Chapter 58. I'm going to, as we usually do, just go through roll call. If you can say your name and your affiliation so we can record who's present. Curtis.
Curtis Smeby, MSU Northern.
Great. Stevie.
Stevie Schmitz from Rocky Mountain College.
Cheryl.
Cheryl Allen, affiliated with the Office of Public Instruction.
Okay. Tracy.
Good morning, everyone. Tracy Mosman. I am filling in for Zach Hawkins here at the Office of Public Instruction.
Okay. Kirk Miller.
Morning, I'm Kirk Miller, associated with School Administrators of Montana.
Okay. McCall.
Hi, good morning, everyone. McCall Flynn at the Board of Public Ed.
Great. Allison.
Hi, Allison Harmon, Dean, College of Education, Health and Human Development at MSU. And Jacqueline, I just wanted to tell you that Gary Lucene, I don't think is admitted as a panelist. He just texted saying he couldn't see it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Tristan, can you help us with that?
Yeah, Gary, are you is your name changed on your profile thing?
According to
know.
that, I do think that's scary.
You do?
Yeah.
Oh, there he is. Okay. Carrie. Kari. Oi. All right.
Kari Orndorff, Montana State University Health Enhancement.
Okay. Emily.
Good morning, everyone. Emily Dean, Director of Advocacy for the Montana School Boards Association.
Hey there. Laura.
Laura Posner-Brown, grade 5 through 8 librarian in Lewistown, Montana.
Okay. Gail.
Gail Stephenson from Sydney, Montana.
Okay. And Gary. Is Gary able to speak if he wants? Oh, there we go. I'm muted.
Yep, I got it. Yeah. Gary Lucene, Bozeman trustee.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Have I missed anyone? Okay. Hold on one second. We'll go to the next slide. Let me just see. There's a chat. Okay, that's Gary. Okay. Here's our agenda for this morning. We have just completed our roll call. We're going to recap our last meeting briefly, talk a little bit with Cheryl to review our progress and give all of us an opportunity to pose any questions we have about our scope of work timeline and process. We're going to check in on initial and advanced accreditation and the CAPE standards. And Anne is going to help us with that and has offered to provide a little bit of background information that may be helpful for the group. We're going to spend a little bit of time priority setting based on what we hear from Cheryl, but it's my working assumption is we have 6 more meetings after this one. And we will check in on that, but if so, and whatever the number is, we want to make sure that we have some plans for how we're going to proceed. And then we're going to hopefully get to some continued discussion of ARM language and identify any possible recommendations we have for change. In our last meeting on August 12th, we discussed and decided not to form subcommittees at this time. We discussed issues related to the broad recommendation that had been brought up the prior meeting to that one, about 1-year residencies for pre-service teachers. We decided more information was needed and to not vote on that broad recommendation at this time. We also reviewed some proposed language changes to subchapter 312 regarding year-long residencies and consolidation possibly of that subchapter and the one about advanced programs. We discussed this and we decided not to take a vote on that at this time. And then we briefly looked at the remaining lever topics that were identified in the very first meeting, and no specific proposed changes were raised, although some issues were brought up at that time. So this is a good meeting for us to kind of assess where we're at and think, project forward to what we need to do to finish this task. Okay, so Cheryl is here with us, as you've seen. What we have here are some questions that Tracy and I have reviewed and have heard folks ask that we thought we could pose to Cheryl. But these are just some questions, and I would love others to bring up additional questions or concerns or perspectives that they would like to share at this time. Cheryl, should we just jump in, or is there anything you'd like to say at the start?
Good morning, everybody. It's good to see you. Appreciate your continued work on the revision of Chapter 58, and I am here to have a good, robust dialogue with you this morning. So let's jump in.
Okay. One thing that's come up, Cheryl, with the group is the request or wondering whether we can get input, information, and or data from folks who are external to the task force right now, experts in the field, such as field placement coordinators, folks from OPI who may have knowledge of some of the repercussions of the language in the ARM or proposed changes. Is there any protocol for inviting others or even asking others to join the group for a while?
Yeah, I think if there are specific questions asking experts to come and inform the group on a revision they're considering would be appropriate. Because of the process that we go through in identifying folks for the task force to ensure we've got representation from diverse groups, that we've got diverse elements across our state, I'd be pretty reticent that we started adding folks because we created the feedback group specifically to keep manageable groups. And so it may very well be folks that are sitting, because I believe we even have some field placement coordinators over with the feedback group. And so pulling from that group of folks that were already identified earlier as interested and willing would be appropriate.
Okay, does anyone have a follow-up question to this? We want to make sure that you're asking all the questions you have about this issue. I know early on there was some concern that did we have the right people here to be able to answer some of the questions that the group has?
Sorry, I can't figure out how to raise my hand. Oh, there it is. I did have raised this question a couple times, that when it comes to drafting things that we've recommended, that it will be difficult for this group to do it. I mean, that without outside expertise. So this is where this has come up a couple of times. We've recommended new endorsement areas that we don't have the expertise on this task force to draft.
Right. So we've had a conversation with that. We've got our comms and legal team working on drafting language. And when we look at the endorsements, we recognize that we can look at those as recommendations for adding under the Epp Accreditation. However, we're also keenly aware that adding endorsements to for the MUS system would be far more than just adding it to the EPP system, that there's dynamics at the university and college levels that would need to go through before saying, oh, look, this is what we want you to do, that there's the same way all of us have processes. And so that's the discussion. So we're certainly making those notations, but recognizing that's a more deep discussion with the MUS system.
Thank you, Cheryl. Okay, I'll move on to the next question, but folks, feel free to raise your hand and with follow-up questions. Can you share anything about the agency's vision for how state standards align with national standards such as CAPE?
I can provide the Bpe Accreditation Standards that we have gone through the process. Dr. Peterson was working on that with our Council of Deans and others to crosswalk the CAPE to the EPP standards. And I believe that the MOU with CAPE has already been implemented, both from the Board of Public Ed has been approved. The superintendent has approved it. And I think that CISPAC also was involved in that. So that alignment, to my understanding from Dr. Merkel, has been to the Board of Public Ed back in July.
Okay, McCall, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. I was just gonna say that the board actually first reviewed this at their July meeting and actually will take a final vote at it at their September meeting. Although I don't see any issues with it, it hasn't quite been implemented or signed yet on the board side.
So we anticipate that crosswalk, that work has been done, and the work with CAPE will continue forward this next year. It's important to note that CAPE also is involved in the site review process for the accreditation process with each of our educator prep providers. Did that answer that? Did that help? And is that what the question was?
I think so. Nobody's objecting.
Okay.
Just a little review. You had mentioned the agency was exploring a year-long residency. Anything you can share around this topic so that everybody hears it would be really helpful.
We know that, as we have discussed, that there's a lot of angst in our local districts about the ability to recruit and retain. In a conversation yesterday, I want to say that right now there's a shortage for 57 special education teachers in our K-12 system. We also know that preliminary research data is showing that folks that complete a year-long residency towards teacher licensure have a higher retention rate. So we've been visiting with a variety of different folks around the idea of looking at a pilot process for this, which would most likely start the fall of 22. Though it doesn't mean we can't do a cycle that someone could start in the spring and complete a spring to spring. It doesn't always have to be fall to spring. And so the agency right now is visiting with entities that potentially can provide the pilot funding. And we have been talking with some key legislators as well that think if we can bring some results before the 23 legislative session is underway, that there's a potential that the legislature could fund those kinds of shifts to how we prepare teachers. So that's where we're at on that right now. So we are exploring the idea of a pilot. We need to visit with the MUS system on this as well. The cost for the pilot, which includes what our student teachers would get paid. There's nothing that precludes that at this time. Would be absorbed in that pilot in the initial year. So that's where we're at so far.
Allison.
Thanks, Cheryl. I was wondering if you could share, you mentioned there was research showing that year-long residencies lead to greater recruitment. I would love to see that information, if you could share that, because that would inform our OG teacher recruitment and retention task force as we're talking about advanced student teaching. And year-long residencies has also come up on that. So I would love to connect some of these dots, Cheryl, if you can.
Yep, I'll be glad to do that.
Thank you so much.
Okay. We've already discussed the new endorsement recommendations. We can have some broad recommendations there. Unless anybody has a follow-up question on that. I think our last question is just to review and we can ask more after this, our timeline and process for deliverables. We want to be crystal clear about what we need to do to coordinate with the Board of Public Ed and to be absolutely clear that we know what our firm deadline is.
Yeah. Jacqueline, are you okay if I share my screen?
Sure.
So I believe we've looked at this early on, but it's a good reminder. So the ARMS schedule with our priority topics that were the research and review that completed in April, starting revision in May, task force through October, and adoption cycles in January and May. So you can see there's some flexibility of times in here. But the goal is that we're at the point of recommended revisions are able to be implemented by July 1, 2022.
Can you clarify, Cheryl? So ideally our work is done by October. Are there interim deadlines when we have to submit proposed changes, or can we presumably, let's just say we are not ready until October to share the full suite of suggested changes that we have? Is that going to be okay?
Of course, we will adapt as we need to, and we will revise with the Board of Public Ed as we need to.
Are there any follow-up questions? Two participants, let me just see who you are. Okay, Laura.
Quick question is, I'm curious how many of our task force members we feel are still active. This is not necessarily pertaining to what Cheryl was talking about. Sorry, Cheryl.
That's okay.
But I feel like we've had a significant drop off in participation from task force members. And I know there's summer vacation to factor into that, but last meeting we were pretty low on attendance, and we weren't able to vote on anything because we didn't have 12 members present. So curious if we still have a quorum and what participation levels are looking like, and the reality of the size of this task and the assigned specialists in their areas that Cheryl was talking about earlier, and how feasible that's all still looking.
We have had drop off for sure. I wonder if there's been a process instituted to circle back with folks and see if they intend to continue.
We can certainly have Tristan send send communication out to folks today.
Kari.
I was just wondering if we'd gotten anything from the from our feedback group, but I haven't ever heard if what their comments or questions or concerns have been with the ideas that we've come up with. Have we heard back from what they have to say?
I'm not sure if the,
Kristen, do you have the notes from the feedback groups that are getting over to this group?
They're on your guys' Google site. If you go to on the top panel where you find your week's information, they're also up in there.
Oh, okay. I'll go look. Thank you.
I was in on that. We've only had one meeting so far, and it was a small group, so there may not be a lot of substantive comments, just so you know. We shared with them broadly what we were discussing at the time and some suggested recommendations, and they had conversation, but I don't believe there were concerns voiced, but I could be wrong, but I don't remember them, so.
And that group meets
surprised.
yeah, Jacqueline, that group meets once a month.
Yes, it's meeting this Monday as well. Gary, you have your hand up.
Yeah, good morning. I'm curious if we are tasked with the responsibility of reviewing all of the subchapters in Chapter 58. So do we have, will this group have to go through each subchapter just to confirm that it's okay or it needs any changes?
That would be helpful if you were able to do that.
Okay. Any other questions for Cheryl while we have her here? Allison.
Thanks. So just, I guess I'm tagging on to Kari's question about the feedback group. And maybe just thinking about if there's expertise that we need, we can pull someone from that group, and that might be a kind of a first stop for, since they've already been identified by Cheryl as folks that should be involved in this process.
Yeah, I think that would be fine. And Tristan, do you have the feedback group members on their site as well?
I don't know if my list is on there, but I can put it there.
That'd be great. So I want to say there's 1 or 2 field placement officers there, as well as other folks.
Laura.
So on the task force members page, we were supposed to go into the spreadsheet Tristan provided and put what our specialty was. And so I want to know if that information will be available for the feedback group so that we can identify like who the 2 field placement people are.
Yes, that's possible.
Gary.
Yeah, getting back to the question on reviewing all the subchapters of 58, would it be possible for the facilitators to maybe look at that and give us some idea of what we'd have to do each meeting, what elements we need to review for each meeting, and to know if we have time to get through all of the subchapters?
Yes.
Gary, I can jump in and say we have a priority setting agenda item today, and we'll definitely want to be talking about that. So thank you. Absolutely. Emily.
I was just curious about the link for the feedback group on Monday. I see the July 26th, but I don't see anything in August for them on the website.
Right. Our next meeting is this coming Monday, the 23rd.
Could we get the Zoom information for that?
Absolutely.
Gary, did you have another question? No.
No
hand
question,
raised.
sorry, I have to lower my hand. Yeah, thanks.
All right. Anything else that folks want to bring up at this time? Laura?
I'm really good at this question thing, I know. Cheryl, on that timeline that you initially shared, was a single row about 7 cells across. And it said that preliminary research and overview was being done, I want to say like October through May or October through April. And I'm curious what research was done in that time. Just what was being done, who was doing it, and how is that playing out now in our task force?
Yeah, sure. That research was an internal work. Dr. Linda Peterson, who retired, led that research team, and there's a whole site of that research, and I believe you were given access to that research, and if not, Tristan will make certain that you have access to that research. That research included looking at the standards, the crosswalk between CAPE and EPP standards was completed, and again, a lot of work around key discussion points. So that is absolutely available to folks if they are interested in what transpired in that research. And there are research notes from all of those sessions as well.
And I know there's a focus group report with a group of stakeholders. I do think the group has looked at that. There's a piece of it. Any other questions, observations that you want to share while we have Cheryl here? Kirk?
So Cheryl, I would just re-emphasize the fact of an appreciation of having the communications and the legal department taking a look at language drafts that are out there, or conceptually taking what the task force brings to the table and then actually writing the language in a legal way such that different sections of recommendations to changes to ARM are not going to conflict with each other. I know that that's been a challenge in the past with groups like this, especially with Chapter 57 going on at the same time. And those recommendations and potentially the crossover of the two with language that ends up causing problems that end up not being recommendations that could be implemented in the end. So bringing to bear the resources of the office to make sure that that happens, I think that's important to this process.
Absolutely, thank you. We're doing that actual crosswalk between the work is 57 and 58. We've got OPI folks meeting on Friday and also looking at 55 because there's intertwining in multiple realms. So legal is actively involved exactly for what you identified, and appreciate that, Dr. Miller.
Okay. I don't see any other hands raised. So thank you, Cheryl, very much
You're welcome.
for taking those questions. I'm sure it will be helpful for us.
It's good to see everybody, and thank you again for your commitment and help on this important work. It's much appreciated.
Thank you. Okay, our next agenda item. We asked for some support from task force members to clarify the initial versus advanced program accreditation and to review some of the issues around the alignment between national and state standards. And Ann Eubank has offered to help us out. Ann, if you want to say anything while I pull up your slides, that would be fabulous. We appreciate you. I want to say that first.
Sure. Thanks, Jacqueline. So you're going to run my slides?
I'm happy to, yes.
That's wonderful. I'll just say next slide when it's time to move forward. First of all, I want to thank the task force for inviting me to share some information about accreditation from the EPP's perspective, and the work that we've done since about 2012, 2013 as a state has really set us up to have excellent EPPs in the state of Montana. And so I was asked to just share kind of a high level overview of how state and national work together. And then I have, to start, I have some guiding principles I'd like to share. Jackie, go ahead and next slide. Okay, so the first thing for all of us to remember is that Montana Board of Public Education accreditation is required. This is in the state of Montana, this is what allows each EPP to issue those institutional recommendations for licensure in Montana and other states. As you know from the data that OPI has produced and the information that most EPP completers work in public schools here in the state. Bpe Accreditation is our national accreditor body for colleges of teacher preparation. There is another national accreditor, and that is AAQEP. And this accreditor emerged several years after we did some really significant work on Bpe alignment. So while that accreditation option has been floated around in our discussions, we have chosen to stay with Bpe. And as Cheryl mentioned, we are in the process, or BPE is in the process of looking at, and then in October, taking a final vote on the state agreement that all EPPs through OPI have with Bpe. So why would some EPPs want to consider using or applying for national accreditation? The answer is that it gives us visibility. It possibly allows us to attract out-of-state applicants, because that's like that kind of seal of approval. State-by-state accreditation is our foundation. That's what's required. Bpe is kind of like the cherry on top. But what we do know is that these things can be really time intensive and have a significant monetary cost to the EPPs. Next slide, please. Okay. So I'll talk a little bit more about the fiscal implications in a bit, but just basically what accreditation is, it provides us with the language and the framework from which to continuously improve. And that's what it's about. It's not about compliance. It's not about, jumping through hoops or an exercise in bureaucratic futility. We use this process to critically examine our programs, to identify areas where we're really doing fantastic work, and then areas where we need to improve. And we do this constantly. We work on accreditation every day, not just every 7 years. We also are required to and invite and encourage lots of stakeholders to help us co-construct our programs. So site visits and the work between site visits requires some really deep partner work with our pre-K through 12 school districts, community members, students, alumni, you name it, whoever we serve, they are all involved in accreditation processes. And we know that not everybody agrees, so we do what we can to move forward and take all of that feedback so that we can ensure that we have the best teachers in front of kids in Montana. Next slide, please. So one of the things that I think is really, really unique about our state is that all 10 Montana EPPs work collaboratively. And this includes our approach to Standard 4, which in both the ARM and in the Bpe standards is program impact. And that is where each EPP is required to demonstrate how the completer's efforts impact K-12 students. Many states use a value-added model or a statistical model that ties teacher evaluations to student test scores. One of the most prominent models is value-added modeling. Historically, as a state, we have not used that. I think Dr. Miller can probably talk a little bit more about the why, but because we don't use that measure, that statistical measure, we have collaboratively created this amazing case study protocol that allows us to look at the Montana landscape of how our completers are impacting K-12 education altogether. And then each EPP has the opportunity to examine into a deep dive case study of one area that completers and employers feel should be improved. Next slide, please. So BPE and CAPE accreditation standards are parallel. They're as parallel as they can be because, as I said earlier, site visits and accreditation have a pretty heavy price tag, both paying the dues for CAPE, and then also the site visit itself is an expensive endeavor, probably upwards of $20,000 per visit when you take everything together, like room and board and flights and all of those things, dinners, etc. Also, there's a huge human resource impact, This is really, really intense work. But we do it because we know it's the right thing to do. It's required by the state, of course, and it's quality control and just making sure that we're doing our jobs here in the EPPs and preparing those teachers for Montana schools. So we have program learning outcomes across our EPPs. We're required to have those. And then the field experiences and the courses have their own like drilled down learning outcomes, but they always link back to the the program learning outcomes. So in our case, the program learning outcomes are really the Chapter 58 standards. That's what we use as a basis. It doesn't mean that EPPs can't have program learning outcomes above and beyond what is in Chapter 58. And many EPPs do that. We do all of what's in 58 plus some, because the field moves faster than the administrative rule is revised. All right, next slide, please. Okay. All right, this is a pretty dense slide, but what I wanted to do is just show you a side-by-side comparison of this parallel structure that I'm talking about. So on the left-hand side, you have Chapter 58, 1058, 501. These are the standards that all Class 1 and Class 2 license or folks recommended for those licenses. That's initial teaching licensure must demonstrate. And so the right-hand side is our in-task standards, and those are national standards that were developed by the Council of Chief State School Officers, of which Superintendent Elson is a member. The in-task standards were developed in 2013. You can see that there's some parallel structure there, but a little bit of difference because Montana has a lot of unique features that we need to make sure that we do what we need to do in Montana to prepare Montana teachers for Montana schools. But you can see that, for example, letter A corresponds with number 1, learner development. And then way down at the bottom of the Chapter 58 side, you can see that there's an IEFA component, and that is always represented in Montana's standards, but not in the national. Next slide, please. Okay, so now I'd like to talk a little bit about the endorsements, and this is what Gary was referring to with, I believe, Gary, you were referring to this with your question about will this task force be required to examine all of the subchapters and make recommendations? So the subchapters, one of the largest subchapters in this chapter is the standards for each endorsement area. So Class 1 and Class 2 licenses are your basic teaching licenses, and then you can have as many endorsements as you want on top of those 2 teaching licenses. There are many educators in Montana who have multiple teaching endorsements. I do myself. I keep my license up to date, and I am Social Studies Broadfield 512 and K-12 Library Media. So I have the ability to teach in both of those areas, as do many teachers across the state of Montana. What I want to bring to your attention today is that, that we have national standards in our content areas that have superseded what we have in Chapter 58 currently. So the highlighted endorsement areas are the endorsement areas that have standards for educators that were created and published after 2015, which was the last time Chapter 58 was revised. You can see the ag eds on there, business, journalism, library media, FCS, language, math, reading specialist, science, traffic education, computer science, and early childhood. That's a more than half of the standards that our national fields have moved past what we have in Chapter 58 currently. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'd like to also talk about Class 3 licenses. Class 3 licenses are your principal, superintendent, and curriculum director licenses. And again, I'll defer to Dr. Miller because he's really the expert in the room. And also, I don't think Stevie's on here, but they know far more about school and district leader preparation than I do. I'm not an expert in this area, but you can see that that on the left-hand side in Chapter 58, we have standards that are pretty well. Let me back up. They are based on a former, a superseded version of the national standards called ISLC, ISLLC. So ISLLC is what Chapter 58 is based upon. And that, again, these standards were created by the Council of Chief State School Officers, of which Superintendent Arntzen is a member. And so the PCEL standards are the new version of those administrator, school leader, district leader, and curriculum director standards. And there's not one-to-one alignment because Chapter 58 has been superseded. What I can share about our EPPs that do have administrator prep programs, they're using the PCEL standards because they're the right standards to use, and they're the standards that the field is using currently. So, and think of it as a both and, okay? So Chapter 58 is absolutely covered. PCEL goes beyond and it prepares our school leaders even better because it's fresher, it's newer. Next slide, please. All right, so now I'm finally going to get into the accreditation stuff. And so the first thing I want to share is that this is a parallel process that was carefully and deliberately constructed for the reasons that I talked about before. Time, monetary cost. It's really hard to run two different accreditation processes for state and national at once. We don't have enough people as it is to teach our classes. It is very, very difficult for EPPs, especially the smaller EPPs that maybe have one faculty member that's full-time, to run two parallel processes if the smaller EPPs want to pursue national accreditation. And so this was an intentional marriage, an intentional alignment of the national standards and the standards in Chapter 58. So once again, we created the standards that we have in Chapter 58 were finalized in 2015. And guess what? CAPE came up with new standards. And while most EPPs are not going to be immediately required to align to these 2022 standards, there's a phase-in period. And so CAPE has superseded what we have in the ARM. You can see that there's some wording changes in standards 1 through 5, but they're fairly similar. So it's just kind of nuanced adjustment of different measures that we use to demonstrate our progress and success in those areas. And then CAPE added two other standards. One is fiscal and administrative capacity. And this one is a little bit scary to me as a department head, I'm going to admit, because what that means is we need to have the correct people with the correct degrees, and we need to have enough of them to be teaching in our programs and advising our students. That's an issue at Montana State. We don't, our educational leadership faculty have about 70, the two of them have about 70 students that they're advising between the two of them. That's just too many. So CAPE is going to begin looking at our fiscal and administrative capacity to effectively run programs in this state. And then Standard 7 is a record of compliance with Title IV of ATA. And Title IV is about student loans, student loan default rates, federal student aid. And so we have to demonstrate as institutions that our default rates are below a certain threshold, things like that, which I'm not too worried about. That's kind of a pro forma. Next slide, please. Okay, same thing with advanced standards. So our advanced standards cover class 3, that's superintendent, principal, and curriculum director licenses. And class 6 is school counselor licenses. School counselors, some school counseling programs are externally accredited by a different body called KCREP. And for CAPE's purposes, CAPE accreditors will just take evidence that the school counseling program is accredited under this national body, and then we're good. We don't have to do anything. But not all EPPs that have school counseling programs participate in CAPE or KCREP. And so Bpe accreditation is the accreditation that must be followed there. And so you can see once again that there's some superseding going on, and those two additional standards are added. And I know that Emily, I think it was you that in one of the previous meetings, you were interested in maybe collapsing the language between initial and advanced standards. And there was a discussion about this because on the surface, they look very, very similar, these two sets, but they are nuanced in really important ways. And that's why it would be my recommendation to keep them separate. They're different programs and just slightly different standards, although they're sort of parallel. Next slide, please. Okay, so just to recap and some takeaways, the current rule was intentionally constructed over several years to facilitate the EPP's capacity to obtain national accreditation. And this is where Stevie might have some additional information. As a smaller EPP at Rocky Mountain College in Billings, it's that collaborative work and that intentional alignment that is what helps EPPs to pursue both of these accreditations. We can conduct joint site reviews, as Cheryl mentioned. That saves us a lot of money. And I have to be realistic. I'm the budget officer, so we need to just make sure we watch our dollars and really use them wisely. And efficiently. Like I said, there's differences between initial and advanced accreditation standards. The endorsements, the endorsement areas, each endorsement area in the past refresh that was adopted in 2015, each of those endorsement areas in the past refresh were carefully constructed by content area experts. So faculty who have expertise in preparing educators in social studies, in family consumer science, in health enhancement, in library media, math, etc. And that was a really deliberate process where each of those endorsement areas had a separate group of experts at the table who could really look at and recommend the skills, knowledges, and abilities that our completers need to have to be successful. Statewide agreements, as Cheryl mentioned, and McCall said, the BPE will be voting on this in October. This statewide agreement is key to our success. It's key to our success because the smaller EPPs who have one full-time faculty member cannot do this on their own. And it's up to all of us. We're Montanans, we roll up our sleeves, we help each other out. This is how we work. It's a very heavy administrative lift, but we're special. I feel so blessed to work in this state because we collaborate and we're not competitive. We're not fighting for students, you know? I came from a state where the 3 EPPs didn't even talk to each other, and they just competed against each other, and that doesn't work here. It doesn't work here because we're such a tight-knit community. We have a small population, and no matter what, if we want to make sure that every kid has a teacher that is qualified, that is well prepared, we have to work together. And I'm just really, really grateful to the Montana Council of Deans of Education for facilitating this work in collaboration with the OPI. We have built something really, really special here. And every time I talk to the Cape Vice President, Melina Monaco, she just always says, Montana, you work together. This is so great that you're talking to each other, that you're building these things. It's a very, very rare thing across the United States. So it's something that we should be proud of. And so I'm hopeful that this information, I went through it really, really quickly, and it's pretty dense. I'm happy to answer any questions, but I hope that this information provides you with some more foundational knowledge to make your recommendations. And I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
Stevie.
I want to thank Ann for her great work as always. I think she's helped all of us understand the importance of the work we're undertaking here together. It is so important. Speaking for the private and the small colleges, the tribal and private schools, it's important, and we believe strongly that we can all do this together. We do have smaller staffs at different colleges, and yet we really strive to have the same standards. And the chapter 57 and 58 are really our guidelines, but we work above and beyond that in the CAPE standards. And I would encourage this group to keep that in mind as we move forward. It is true, as was pointed out, that it looks like some of these standards could be collapsed together and make them more succinct, but they're written for different audiences and for different purposes, even though they may cover some of the same material. Not every EPP has advanced programs. And so for those of us who do, we really need to have the differentiation between initial and advanced licenses. So all these things are really important, but I think Ann's point, well made, is that how well we work together. The council is a united mind in how we proceed and how we support one another. It's because we do that we can make sure that every EPP is successful. And as she said, we collaborate. We do not compete with each other. We find ways to work together. We share students from time to time. We make sure that the product we put out is one that we are all proud of. And I think that needs to be reflected in our work, in that for all of us who have just a different finger in the pond here, the big picture is the students that we prepare to be teachers. And we are going to continue to have processes that move above and beyond PEPs, but we're grounded in what we have in common. And that's really, really important that we keep that in mind as we move ahead. So again, thanks to Ann for the good work that she always does.
Thank you, Stevie. Kirk has his hand up.
Yeah, good morning, Ann. I just want to offer a great encouragement and thank you to you for what you just provided to the task force. I think is extremely valuable. You've encapsulated 4 decades worth of effort around what I'd like to bring to the task force as describing the fact that the quality of education in Montana rests in a large way upon the licensure of the teacher. And we're different than other states. You think about other states that have high stakes testing, like at the high school level, that ends up being the gauge for what kind of quality was provided in the K-12 system for the children in that system. We don't do that in Montana. And there's a long history around that. And in fact, the quality of the educator that's in the classroom is the deciding factor of the quality of what's provided to the educational quality of what's provided to children in Montana. And so the fact that there's 3 to 4 decades worth of history around Chapter 58 and the rules that are established there and the collaborative efforts that have been made for those 3 to 4 decades to ensure that the rules really match what we know that we need to provide for with the child at the center. They didn't just happen. They happened as a result of a huge amount of collaboration, which you have just described, that's there. And so for our task force and the Chapter 57 task force, I hope that maybe you would go and give this presentation to the Chapter 57 task force as well, because their work on the licensure and making changes to the licensure rules really needs to have this kind of foundation about the history of where we got to and how important it is to make sure that all of this work is done collaboratively, because in the essence, Montana and the quality of education that we provide really does rest with that individual who ends up in the classroom in front of our children, providing those educational opportunities across the board. So thank you, Anne, for a great review.
Does anybody else have a question or comment about the implications of what Anne has shared? Laura.
Okay, so just walk me through this. So a number of times, Anne, you used the word superseded. And so where does the ARM Chapter 58, why does it exist? And then how does that existence tie in with our national and Bpe accreditation or the other agencies that are used for accreditation? Why does the state one exist? And I think I can answer this question, but I just want it to be out there for everyone to consider. Okay.
Yeah, Laura, that's a really great question. Why do we need state and national? The reason we need state is because of the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, that education is one of those states' responsibilities. And so the administrative rules of Montana allow EPPs to have their programs accredited and to issue those critical institutional recommendations. So basically, Bpe can't give us that authority because Bpe is not a government entity. The Board of Public Education can, and the agency that facilitates that work is OPI. And so that's why I say that state is required, but Bpe is optional. We do not have programs unless we are state accredited. We cannot operate. And so that being said, using the word superseded is just to, the standards development seems to move more quickly than the establishment of the administrative rule. And that's just by virtue of our wonderful, messy representative democracy, right? So we're always kind of playing catch up. But I think what's important to know is that standards are the baseline. Standards are the baseline, and we exceed what is in Chapter 58 as a matter of course, because it's not all there. We know that there are emerging things. Like there's nothing in Chapter 58 currently about brain science, and that's a really emerging field, right? And so inserting the social emotional learning language is a way to honor that and to honor how the field of educator preparation has progressed. We will, no matter what, we will always be playing catch up with Chapter 58. I think you can bet on that. But just know that each EPP teaches this plus a whole bunch of other stuff. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome.
Perfect.
So Laura, I would just go a little bit further. I think Ann is spot on in the way she just described that. It's Article 10 of the Montana Constitution, which describes and gives the authority to the Montana Board of Public Education for general supervision of a system of public education in Montana. And the Office of Public Instruction and their huge role in assuring that general supervision of a quality system of schools is at the foundation of being able to implement everything that has been described. And so chapters 55, 56, 57, 58 of the Administrative Rules of Montana basically form the accreditation standards and the standards around teacher prep programs, which is what we're working on, the licensure standards. All of that stuff rolled together is constitutionally founded in the general supervision of a system of public schools in Montana. And so you'll constantly see in the end, kind of the fight between, it's not a fight, it is our democracy and the way that our republic operates, that the legislature at times are trying to capture control of the territory that belongs to an administrative branch or the judicial branch. And so there's an ongoing dialogue always, every legislative session, about the role of the legislature and what they would do to impose standards upon our public schools, or what they would want to be taught, how it should be taught, and when it should be taught, those kinds of things. And that authority, quite frankly, rests with the Board of Public Education based upon our Constitution in Montana. And so the work that's being done here is hugely important on a very, very broad scope about in the history of Montana. And so again, I think, Ann, you're spot on in explaining that role of how important Chapter 58 is. And then I would add that Chapter 55, 56, and 57 are equally as important in all of the work that gets done so that we continue to operate the quality system of public schools that we're able to operate. And another comment is that the legislature generally holds the purse strings for being able to make all of that happen. And so within all of that I've just described, there's this constant back and forth going, if you change the accreditation standards, or if you change Chapter 58 standards, and there's a significant fiscal impact, the legislature does have to become involved in a manner of that we do a review. A charge would be that if Chapter 58 makes recommendations that end up having a significant fiscal impact and would require money to come to support that, we'd have to do a fiscal impact study on what that looks like and present that to the interim committee of the Education Interim Committee of the legislature with the request that when we're ready to implement the new rule changes, the legislature would have to be aware that that's going to happen. And I'm saying that very specifically because the legislature doesn't have the ability to say, no, you can't implement new rules. And they do have the obligation to pay for them. We just need to give the legislature enough time to be able to find the funding or find the resources that are available to implement what the new rules are. That's truly the authority of the Board of Public Education and the way our Constitution was written, so that other forms of government would not have the ability to make changes to the quality of education being provided to the children of Montana based upon we don't have enough money to do that, or we don't have enough will to do that, or the political atmosphere is such that we're not going to do that. All these checks and balances are, extremely important to the system, the way that it's run. And again, I'll bring it back to Chapter 58 is an important part of that, because how we prepare those educators that are going to be in our classrooms, in our public schools, and in all schools across the state is so hugely important to the quality that we're able to provide, a quality of education that we're able to provide to the children.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Anne, again, for your presentation. I hope it's helpful. Stevie, I want to move on because I do want to do the priority setting, but if you have a quick comment, please.
It's just a quick one that I think Anne pointed out, but I want to pay a little attention to, is that even though half of the EPPs are CAPE accredited as well as state accredited, for the smaller private and tribal schools, it's really important that there is a great crosswalk between the PEP standards and CAPE standards. The agreement we have with CAPE is that we'll have joint visits focusing on the same things. So even though some of us are not able to fiscally or have enough manpower to do CAPE, we actually do CAPE through the state standards. So as CAPE has changed, I would urge us to look at the standards 6 and 7 that are added and make sure that we put something in 58 that mirrors that change as well. That's it.
Okay. That's a good suggestion to put on our table quickly. Curtis?
I would endorse or support Stevie's comments related to 6 and 7, but also encourage, OPI for additional training or opportunities for training. I know with faculty changeover, retirements, et cetera, especially in smaller institutions, our institutional history goes out the window pretty quickly. And so continued and regular opportunities, not only to train, but to help implement. Training is only one part. We have we know implementation science, we need support. And we can get support from other institutions, or I like to call our motherships. But I think it's kind of interesting and helpful if there is an opportunity to help people with the implementation of these things. And although it's continuous, there's always a big push the last 2 or 3 years because of all the data that needs to be collected. So I would encourage the Council of Deans to engage in that and support that kind of effort. So thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Okay, well, that was a good discussion. I hope that it's helpful. We said in our agenda that we would spend a little bit of time acknowledging where we are in our process and trying to set some priorities for the upcoming meetings. As you heard, we are responsible for reviewing to the best of our ability all of the subchapters in Chapter 58. It may be that we recommend to keep them, to replace them with something else, or to add language, a new subchapter, as we've already actually recommended, and I know those things need to be reviewed. But there's a decent amount of material here. So one thing we thought we might be able to do is lay out a little bit of a schedule, or at least think about how we can move through that language and ensure that we're at least looking at it for issues that are relevant to the task force, that the task force has identified. So we can, Tristan, do we have one tracker that has all of the language? I don't think we have one that has all of the language on there.
No, I haven't, but I could go put the whole chapter on one tracker.
We could do that. And do folks have access to that PDF that has all of the language, the full chapter? I think they do. Is it on the site?
Yes, I put all of the trackers for the lever topics on the site, but there is not one yet for the full chapter.
Okay. There's a PDF for that as well. So we have 6 meetings remaining after this one in August and September. I'm not sure. I meant to ask Cheryl exactly when in October we have to stop meeting, or that our meetings end. But assuming that they end in September, by the end of September, there are 6 more meetings. So one reason we've thought about having subcommittees is there may be an advantage to having groups of folks look at several subchapters and come back to the next meeting and say, these are some areas that we've talked about that show up in the ARM, that show up in the language, and we may want to look at it, not to make recommendations or anything, but just to review and surface important issues. All of you have access to the full ARM at the very least in a PDF, and we do need to ensure that that happens. Is there something I can pull up right now that would be helpful? Okay. Is this, Tristan, is this what you put in the chat? Is this that document that has a bunch of links in it?
Sorry, the one that I put was chapter 57. I'm posting chapter 58 right now, but
Okay,
that is the Secretary of State's
right, okay.
website.
Sometimes I find it easier to just look at a PDF, but this will work.
Jacqueline, I think you can hit the view as ebook, and that's the PDF version.
Okay. I don't know, maybe I'm the only one who feels that way. Here, but thank you. Here it is. This is the whole thing. And we've touched on some of these, especially in 301 and 501, I believe. But we do need to have a strategy to ensure that some of us have reviewed them and have surfaced issues that are important to the group, or that have a suggestion for how to do that. Gary, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I'm just curious. The information received today was extremely helpful, especially to me. So I'm curious will the task force, with the general structure of our approach from now on, be to make sure Chapter 58 includes all of the CAPE standards plus any additional or unique standards that exist in Montana? Is that a reasonable guidance for the task force or not?
Somebody want to address that? That's a good question. Allison, you have your hand up.
Gary, from my perspective, from an EPP perspective, I think that that's really important what you just said, that we should work to align and add things that we think are specific to Montana that go beyond. And that I don't think any EPP would argue with that, the importance of addressing specific Montana needs. But we, as a minimum, we need to be aligned with those national standards, with the CAPE standards.
Thank you.
Stevie, your hand is up.
I agree with Allison entirely. And the other thing I think that we need to keep in mind is reaching out to our partners to find out if there are any issues with Chapter 58 that we have an opportunity to correct or modify right now. But I think that the CAPE alignment is so important, and EPPs would be expecting that to happen.
May I ask a follow-up, Stevie?
Sure.
Are there a set, I know we talked about standard 6 and 7. Are there a number of other areas where we need to better align? You feel we need to better align Chapter 58 with the national standards? Or is it more a warning not to include things that aren't aligned?
It's not a warning. It's knowing that we will always have the PEP standards as our foundation and other national standards, either by subject area or by overall, that will move us forward as well. But I think we may have some language problems that we want to make sure that we correct or change. And we haven't really looked at the rule in that regard. Like if there are things that aren't working for us right now, this is our opportunity to modify or correct those.
And do you have specific things in mind, or do other people in the task force already have a number of things in mind that we can actually list here and look at? Because that could be one way to set some priorities for our remaining meetings.
I think we could reach out to.
But I can't hear.
I think we could reach out to our licensure officials, our field placement, and the council in a brief survey and get that information. It was collected initially in some of that review and research that happened, but I don't know where it went from there.
Jackie, I'm going to suggest that the endorsement areas are areas that need to be reviewed. And this is where it would be helpful to be able to pull in for this task force to be able to say, hey, we need a computer science, expert to come in and just talk about this so that we can make sure that we're on track.
Mm-hmm.
Are there specific endorsements you're thinking of, or are you thinking of the 3 that this task force recommended adding, or both? Can you clarify?
Definitely the new ones that we've recommended. And I think that all of the endorsement areas that are superseded by national standards need to be, we can work on alignment there. And so Anne presented that slide that had those highlighted, and those, I think that's where we need to focus our efforts versus ones that are already aligned.
Okay, so a list of, we should look at that slide, create that list, and put that on our list of priority topics to get to. I also heard alignment to standards 6 and 7, including some language in chapter 58 that's aligned, that these are proposed changes. I'm not saying we should do this, that these are changes we need to move on and talk about. Gary, do you have your hand up anew, or is it from before? Gary, oh, hands down. Okay. Are there other big issues? I know we've talked about year-long residency, and Gary actually had some questions about that it would be lovely to get to. But I want to make sure that we kind of can generate, at least after this meeting, a list of priority topics that we need to do so that we can lay them out in a schedule and say, this is what we are going to talk about in the next 6 meetings. Emily.
Thanks. I was going to mention, I think just making sure that we loop back to the items from last week that we weren't able to vote on because there wasn't a quorum.
Yes.
To include those.
Yep. Okay, absolutely. Sorry about that. I was writing some notes. Sorry. Stevie.
I don't know if this is something that we'll deal with, but I want to put it on the table for reminding everyone, as we've talked about the collaborative nature.
I might actually be able to. No, I don't want to leave webinar.
I want to
There.
remind us if there's a trial or a test or a pilot or year long, I would encourage us to include a private or tribal so that we could look at the additional obstacles or challenges or opportunities that come from the smaller organizations as well as the larger MUS EPPs.
Thank you. Okay. Emily, do you have your hand up again? Or is it just from before?
Sorry.
That's all right. No problem. I don't see any other hands raised. That this isn't the end of this conversation, but this gives us a bit of a list that we can look at and start prioritizing for each meeting what we're going to talk about. And we may do some back and forth with some of you to make sure we're covering some of the things that's covering the items you've mentioned. Gary, I was going to ask you, and I see your hands up, you did have some suggestions about some of the language around year-long residencies and clinical experience. is this a good time to bring that up? We have just about 5 more minutes, but we can at least talk about it.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, I can do that. But how many subchapters are there in chapter 58? Is there 6?
Some of these have been removed. Yeah, so that's why I like the other list a little bit better because it shows you which ones have come out.
There's 9.
9.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just curious if we have 6 meetings left, if we just, next meeting, we identify chapters, subchapter 1 and 2 or something to discuss, or 1 if they're big topics, but just, I guess, so we have a plan to get through it
Yep.
all, but
I think we're going to
Good.
need to do that as well. So we'll have some topics that we know we need to make changes in. We'll start with those, but we're also going to have to be mindful that we don't leave any of the subchapters out. So Zach and I will work on creating that schedule.
Okay.
Some of these
yeah,
are,
and then just,
yeah, let's talk
Yeah.
about the other issue.
well, yeah, this other issue really deals with the recommendation the task force was trying to come up with regarding the year-long residency program, and looking at 1058-312. I guess the thought is that language may already allow that to occur. So just made me think that maybe we don't need to address that. But I think having clarification and validation that the language in 1058-312 really does allow the EPPs to pursue a year-long residency program. And then go from there. Whatever the conclusion is on that, then I think make a recommendation on how to do that, if that's relevant. Based on the information we have today, I'm not sure, where it stands at this point, but
Gary, would it be okay if I pulled up the specific language you highlighted in your message?
sure.
Might be helpful to folks. Yeah, I just have it in the sections. Oh, sorry, that's not it. Here we go. You make this a little bigger. Hold on. So the highlighted language is where Gary is asking, discussing whether this already permits one-year residencies. Or does it need to be adjusted in any way?
And there's one more down below D.
Yep, here it is.
So looking at that D, I mean, the partners and EPPs are working together to design these experience, and they can be, different durations based on the needs. That's what it sounds like to me.
Yeah.
So there's nothing here that doesn't allow a year-long residency. I think that the group has squarely, discussed objections or issues and challenges to requiring them in the ARM. So the question was whether to make a broad recommendation that this is something that should be explored further. It sounds like the agency is already exploring this and is planning to have a pilot, hopefully with good data collected to look at the results and to look at the challenges in implementation. So I wonder whether we have reached the end of this part of our discussion around clinical experience, particularly a one-year paid experience. Now, we did add some language that clarified that participants could be paid through stipends. So that was an important piece that was added. Or
I
suggested.
think if there's a pilot planned and there's data collected, like you just suggested, Jacqueline, that's what should inform a rule change versus the rule change preceding testing it. I think we have to test it first. It's not prohibitive by the current language. Let's test it. Let's explore the challenges and benefits, and then let's make a rule change. I would say that's a really good approach.
Makes sense. And so at one point, I think we just wanted to make sure there would be such sharing of information and that there would be pilots. Sounds like that's already happening, but I mean, there's no reason the task force can't say it's pleased that there's going to continue to be Montana-based research on this strategy. That's great. Gary, is your hands, do you have another question or comment?
Oh, no,
No.
I'm sorry. I'm
Oh,
sorry.
that's okay.
There we go.
That's okay. All right. Any other comments or questions? I recognize the need to create, we recognize the need to create a list and to kind of make sure that we're moving forward on the subchapters. So I think you should look for some homework, some very specific spots in the ARM that we ask everybody to look at to see if there are concerns. And as mentioned, we're going to probably start with some of the areas in the endorsements and some of the spots in the ARM where the alignment to national standards, excuse me, may need to be strengthened. But we do need to the best of our ability, look at all of it to see if there are other issues that have come up. And in no way do we want to foreclose or curtail broader discussion of changes. So feel free to bring up other issues in these meetings that you feel are important that we get on our list to discuss, because our time our end is approaching, and we're also going to circle back and talk to other folks, folks who we haven't seen in a while, to confirm or clarify whether they're going to continue to participate. Any other final observations or comments before we close? Again, I want to thank Anne and all of you for sharing some background information that would be valuable to this group. Appreciate it. Tracy, is there anything else I've missed?
No, Jacqueline, I think that was a great summary.
All right, well, it was an easy day for me. Thank you, everybody. Have a good rest of your day, and we'll see you in a week. And look for some information from us soon.
Okay.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks for the great work and presentations.
Thank you.